My name is William Wade. I'm a senior here at Loyola University Chicago, a major in psychology, and a minor in one of the Latin crowd Catholic studies minors. So thank you for having me here today. Conversation in Convalescence, living the Jesuit mission globally. What does it mean? For us to understand this, we've got to draw a line directly back to our companion, Ignatius. I imagine, when I think of Casa Loyola, the long, cold stone basalt hallways with tall concrete buttresses on each side, casting shadows down, lace on the floor. As Magdalena, an important role here in my talk is shuttling food and water and health services back and forth to our very, very vulnerable Ignatius. In this was a warm and candlelit room in which Ignatius lied in a convalescence, and Magdalena was serving him with a very, very crucial piety and devotion. He had just been transported back from Ancona from his battle, 75 miles southeast, around a 1 week's journey. In this, it left his funny 5'4" height maimed to a very funny 5'2" height, in which case he was kind of offering his leg up to the angels and took a little bit of an ego check there. But Ignatius knew in his bed here that the springtime of 1521 would look a lot different. This would not be battles fought across Spain. This would be battles fought in his heart, in his will, and with God. Convalescence itself stems from the Latin poem, which is a with or togetherness, and from volare, which is very McMurphian strength or valor. And in that, there's a very active nature. It is not passive in itself. You have to grow strong. You have to regain health. It's not laying down in bed so much. Convalescence is a principle in an active tone. Now, Ignatius is a companion of Saul, so I need not give a complete biography. However, it is just important to emphasize that he's reading of the life of Christ and the lives of the saints, all brought together what it's like to flex the muscle of healing and to convalesce in truth. Not necessarily to yawn and lean back, which a lot of us can do in healing, but he stayed very sharp, steadfast, very saintly. In a chat last year with our late sister Jean, a dear friend of mine, I had visits with her every other week for some sort of pastoral care. And she had an acute spiritual wisdom that no one else at this university has yet matched. In that vulnerability, after we had gained a rapport, I was like, I'm going to ask her about something very raw and truthful, and that was World War II. I wanted to know a little bit of the gravity that she had and how it played out for her and her family. Upon asking this, she reminded me of her brothers Edward and Raymond, who were involved in World War II, either from enlisting or being drafted, but mentioned the depth of the sacrifice that meant for her brothers as a self-sacrifice, and then for her and her parents and the broader family as that was a sacrifice for them all. They were all involved in the pain that was about to be pursued throughout the depth of that war. She described it and how it changed their family dynamic forever. Yep. I was a freshman at the time, a sophomore, and she emphasized how pain here was used as an avenue towards grace and towards holiness, towards the sacred. Not necessarily something to get down on, but to use it to understand in the context of her faith. In that way, she offered me St. John of the Cross's words, that the purest suffering bears and carries in its train the purest understanding. In context of Ignatius, we have to wrestle and try and empathize with what his situation was, what it's like to see our story and his story, and to understand the depth that he experienced and where we can find that depth within our lives. Good. This summer, I was fortunate enough to go on an active, very hands-on trip in an inclusive convalescence that was happening abroad. In this, our whole group was taking more of a Magdalena role rather than an Ignatian role, as we were traveling to the hurt, to the injury, rather than the Ignatian convalescent guy. For context myself, Dr. Murphy, Dr. Noonan, other Loyola leaders, lots of Catholic university administrators from other schools, and then clerics came together in order to kind of flex the muscle of healing in the church and what we could do. This was all to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. In this, we were met at a contact point by Professor Hiro, who is an anthropologist from Northwestern, who was Japanese, in which we met, and he was our host, our generous host, that was necessary to be a touch point to make this entire thing work. In so doing, he was the arranger, like Derek, of translation and bullet trains and masses and prayer services. Not a lick of what happened wouldn't have been for him, someone so honest in his faith and so strong between both cultures. Integral to make it all happen. I will say our goal here had to be very clear, that the strong message was to emphasize from the perspective of the Catholic Church that nuclear disarmament is necessary, and any form of nuclear weapon maintenance and, of course, its use is always morally illicit. In this way, we had a very, very strong message, and we were guests in someone else's country. Quite a contrast. Not necessarily the most humble and gentle approach to try and find peace. Very, very loud. In that way, the spiritual depth, the wisdom from the leaders was necessary for us to remain humble, to see the wisdom, and use that paramount element of healing, which was that of listening. Good. Japan, post-World War II, once the dust had settled, had understood their role as, particularly Hiroshima, as a place for peace where people could come, lead conferences, gather hosts from other countries, and hold meetings in which peace was the end result. Post-tragedy of the atom bombings, they were the ones upholding this element of listening. Bringing people together and lending an ear was key. We think of Ignatius, weeks and weeks in bed, lying down, listening for God's voice. Did he occasionally cuss at God in Castilian Spanish? Probably. But he was also forced to stay there and to heal and to listen. From that, we drew what is the foundation of this exercise, which is that of discernment. To listen for God's voice and to act in accordance with that will. Manifesting for us in a diverse series of ways. Firstly, gathering around and listening to the Hibakusha, which are the first-person, soul-to-soul narratives of folks who experienced what it was like in that August of World War II, when our ancestors brought tragedy upon them. That's a photo of people listening to what that is. Secondly, striking encounters at the World Peace Service in Hiroshima, where myself, Matthew, and Maddie from Notre Dame came together both in prayer and also offered prayer peace lanterns, which floated down from Hiroshima down the river toward Nagasaki later that week. Very beautiful. And thirdly, holding seminar discussions with both U.S. Catholic University students and Japanese Catholic University students. Coming together, acknowledging the views of discouragement that were there, discussion taking place, and driving towards peace. Very important process. Grounded in listening. Interwoven between all of this and the abilities that we had was the kindness, generosity, and acute spiritual depth, again, of the leaders, including papers and discussions by academics like Dr. Murphy, including sermons from clerics, and for students, sometimes sharing simple stories over sashimi sushi. That meant the harvest was abundant and the labors were abundant, all coming together. In this, we had a group of motivated believers committed to that humble act of listening while striving towards peace, and at the same time understanding the slowness, downtime, and quiet to listen for God's voice. For all of us who have traveled before, we know that that hurriedness in motion in travel can sometimes obfuscate the real reason that you're there. In this case, we had to be reminded of the Eucharist we were brought to, in that these motivated believers were called to convalesce slowly in the healing process. It didn't have to just happen. Good. Ignatius' exam, one of the many spiritual thoughts after his convalescence had ended, calls to mind consolation, our closeness with God, and desolation, more of a distance with God. In the magnetism for our group, we were constantly, at least I like to think I was constantly feeling both. In the case of consolation, quite simple, as there was such muscle shown by the Catholic Church that we were going to send people to pray and to find peace. Very good, very disciplined too. Desolation, the distance, where it wasn't the same outline as pilgrimages are found common within our faith. A lot of the time, whether you're engaging in a pilgrimage to Tizet or Fowler or Lourdes, there's a sanctuary you go to and you pray and you feel the presence of the relics and the Holy Spirit. Good. Say you're picking a section of the trail in Spain where you would go on the Camino, and hike a section down. Good, there's an outline. This was not so much the same. We had to go, and we had to meet people, and faces, and souls. And in that way, it was very different. So I had to become comfortable in that discomfort of what had happened before we arrived. In which case, their parents, and grandparents, and great-grandparents' lives had been transformed by my grandparents, great-grandparents. What would that look like? That is the key where I felt Sister Jean's advice coming into place. You're going to feel a little uncomfortable. There is sacrifice there, intergenerational sacrifice, just like what the indigenous experienced with Jonathan saw. Very huge differences in what we see between our people today, our missionaries showing in, and the people before us. In these consoling and not so consoling moments, in rooms of dialogue and exchange, they were steeped every time in the heavy breath of the Holy Spirit. It's never gone. In this case, I did find myself, as many did, occasionally apologizing to the Japanese students there. I'm sorry for what we've done. I'm sorry for my Americanness, parts of my identity. They were good. They knew nothing, which to say, that's not right. My good friend Iko, Billy, that's not why you're here. In that way, we were brought back. We were back in that peaceful dialogue, working towards that goal. Ignatius personally taught me and others what it means to listen and to pray in a way where we can discern, listen for God's voice clearly. That convalescence and stillness and quiet of those hallways, with those shadows, and the clip-clop of Magdalena running back and forth. And his courage and his volare to break to areas of prayer he never thought he would imagine, inviting the wisdom of John Newman, knowing that Ignatius did not ask to see the distant scene. He was called to the air. He was called to that cot, to that cool room, to that sacred silence. In this way, my reflection upon the pilgrimage is filled with various perspectives and very simple moments. The talk is not necessarily meant to be a diary. This isn't meant to be a memoir. And it certainly is not meant to be a receipt of photos and times that we spent. I rather would like to offer it more of a hopeful gift that is a point of view to healing and growth, seldom recognized in our world today, and I believe is found so beautifully within our church. The moments that we shared are glimpses into that rather paradoxical, effervescent silence that Ignatius was emphasizing. And in these moments, Ignatius taught me and our group what it personally means to convalesce and what it personally means to heal. Thank you.
I mean, Billy, that was just beautiful. Would you say we were 4 for 4 on talks today? I would say so. I just want to highlight the lines related to you guys. I mean, the language. First of all, Magdalena, Magdalena is Ignatius' sister-in-law. He may have a little crush on her, but she doesn't handle him. Cool phrase, really. Steeped in the heavy breath of the Holy Spirit. That's a good place to be. Then the last one, I didn't get all. The paradoxical effervescence of silence. That's good. You honor Sister Jean. That's good.
Dear friend?
Sister Jean is more than a bobblehead. She's been tending souls here at Mundelein and Loyola for, I don't know, how long was it? Come here since 1950? Maybe like 70 years. All right, I've said my piece. What'd you hear of Billy's? Dialogue with Billy? Ask a question. What do you think?
Thank you, Billy. One word that kind of kept occurring to me as you were talking about your experience, and also, Ignatius' experience during his convalescence. Vulnerability or humility, but I think vulnerability, being open to one's own vulnerability. I think Ignatius embracing the fact that, the knight in shining armor now needs to be vulnerable enough to be cared for. And I think the vulnerability that you showed when you were in Japan, I'm curious, how does vulnerability kind of play into the kind of spirituality that you presented for us today?
Good. Thank you, Master Arranger. I think vulnerability is key in the diverse groups we were dealing with, because I personally did not know most of the students who were on this trip from a multitude of universities, nor the leaders. I was only semi-friends with Dr. Murphy at the time, so God knows what was going to happen. It was key to listen more than ever, so that I could understand their story, and we could get further prayer. One of the universities that was with us was the University of New Mexico, which is secular. We had all these Catholic universities, and then one that was out of the way, with students who themselves were not Christians nor Catholic. Fascinating. Almost more diverse than the Catholic Japanese students were in, because there's different levels to ways you can understand people on the level of faith and on the level of honest dialogue. So they were there to portray the project outside of Albuquerque that they test the nuclear sites at, and they continue to do research. And they were specially invited to bring that depth of knowledge to our trip. Had I not listened and had I been vulnerable to the fact that I had to ask these folks, what is it that you do? Why are you here? Not so much spiritually, but they're coming with something to provide. And if it's not up to me to be vulnerable in my faith, saying, oh, I'm so glad you're here because this is what I feel on a spiritual level, then that vulnerability is only providing more depth in this deep well of what we have to bear. Good question. I hope I answered it. Thank you.
That's great. Someone else?
I'm curious, so the convalescence of Ignatius and what it taught you, I think is a really beautiful image. And at least in this particular instance, it seems like the folks from Japan that you met would have been more akin to Ignatius, and the folks from the United States coming in would have been more aligned with the French forces who shot the cannibal. And I'm curious that in terms of the vulnerability that you showed, I think is really beautiful, and also coming in from the side of the aggressor in this instance that caused the harm. And I'm curious about the type of convalescence that needs to happen for the people causing the harm as opposed to the people that were harmed.
Great question. Thank you. I had to categorize and compartmentalize my brain. My grandfather just passed away this summer. Thomas Fitzgerald Rooney was a medic in the war. And I have to place in this bucket of the French who may have launched that cannonball. Okay, so that's there. We have the Japanese, they are ancestors of the Hibakusha that you saw. Present there. That woman's 5 brothers who may have lost. Compartmentalized. 2 generations down, here we are. The Magdalena role. The Japanese, you have Hibakusha, crossing over there. That's when I need to accept my own category as it's not totally role play. Like Magdalena, a little, and in the same tone, holding the fact that my grandfather and his actions are in relation to me and also count. Where does that come together? Was often very fuzzy. Hence why I found myself apologizing and didn't really know why. Weird. So that's where I'll leave that. Thank you.